Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event, Capitalism, Race, and Class, the Case of McDonald's, with our very special guest, Professor Marcia Chatelain. Our program this evening is the third of a fall series of programs at St. Olaf on the topic of the presidential election in a nation in crisis, polarization, pandemic, prejudice. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm a professor at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute sponsoring tonight's event and the fall series just mentioned. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and support free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and fosters constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing our event tonight, very special thanks go to Institute Assistant Director Eric Grell and Institute Student Assistant Jess Horst. Thanks also to Jeff O'Donnell, Joshua Wyatt, and the St. Olaf Broadcast Media Services crew, and to Andrea Galswick, Dan Hollering, and Carrie Vanderveen of St. Olaf Marketing and Communications. Finally, thanks to St. Olaf College faculty and students who have integrated their study with our program this evening, particularly participants in the Public Affairs Conversation program supported by the Institute, but also classes in history, media studies, philosophy, religion, and social work family studies here at St. Olaf College. To remind our virtual audience members, you are invited to submit a question at any point during the discussion this evening by using the Participate tab on the streaming page. We are honored to have with us tonight as our distinguished guest, Marcia Chatelain, who is the Provost's Distinguished Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Georgetown University. The author of Southside Girls Growing Up in the Great Migration, published by Duke University Press in 2015, she teaches about women's and girls' history as well as about Black capitalism. Her latest book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, published by W.W. Norton earlier this year, examines the intricate relationship among African American politicians, civil rights organizations, communities, and the fast food industry. She is a current co-host of the Slate podcast, The Waves, which covers feminism, gender, and current events. An active public speaker and educational consultant, Chatelain has received awards and honors from the Ford Foundation, the American Association of University Women, and the German Marshall Fund of the United States. At Georgetown, she has won several teaching awards. In 2016, the Chronicle of Higher Education named her a top influencer in academia in recognition of her social media campaign, #FergusonSyllabus, which implored educators to facilitate discussions about the crisis in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. She has held an Eric and Wendy Schmidt Fellowship at New America, a National Endowment of the Humanities Fellowship, and an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. There is so much more that might be said about Professor Marcia Chatelain's impressive accomplishments. In the interest of time, we must be brief and incomplete. Sorry, Googling will bring you the rest. Marcia, welcome. We are so pleased to have you with us this evening.
Thank you so much. And I'm so grateful not only to the gracious invitation, but the fact that we were able to do this virtually. When you originally contacted me, we thought we would do this in person. So I'm glad that we were able to make this work.
Yeah, I'm very pleased too, and we all are pleased too that we were able to make this work out despite the challenging circumstances. So thank you for being with us. Marcia, one of the crises our nation faces in this extraordinary presidential season is a crisis of race. As mentioned already, our topic tonight is Capitalism, Race, and Class, the Case of McDonald's. That is, McDonald's, the fast food restaurant chain, about which you have written in a couple of articles and in your splendid book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in America. An exceedingly rich and insightful book. Marcia, congratulations on its publication and very positive reception among reviewers and commentators. Marcia, the author of another book about McDonald's published in the past year, Chris Arnade, says in his book, and I quote, "If you want to understand the country," that is to say the United States, "if you want to understand the country," he says, "visit McDonald's." Now, what Arnade has in mind in saying this differs in important ways from the main contentions in your own work on this fast food chain. But what you do suggest in your work is that if you want to understand capitalism and race in America, then visit McDonald's, or rather study the history of McDonald's as that history entwines with the history of the African American community roughly from the late 1940s to the present time. Marcia, how does studying the connected history of McDonald's and the African American community during this period help us to understand capitalism and race in America?
Well, thank you for that wonderful opening question, because I think that the layers that McDonald's presents to us and the layers that McDonald's obscures is what has always been very curious and provocative to me. So when we think about the narrative, even of McDonald's brothers, of Ray Kroc, we think about American innovation, we think about car culture, we think about the growth of the suburbs. This idea that McDonald's exists because of American innovation and insight is absolutely true. But McDonald's also exists because of the racial exclusions that allowed for a certain type of prosperity to emerge after World War II. And so I think that McDonald's provides us a prism, not only in the ways that racial exclusion allowed a certain group of people to capitalize on a post-war economy and create the fast food industry, but McDonald's also allows us to think about the ways that Black America has been presented with ideas for change, for prosperity, and for revolution that are always tied to capitalist markets that will exploit or exclude African Americans when necessary. And so as we watch ourselves in this particular moment in which people are saying that the United States is in another racial reckoning, people often liken it to 1968. And while I don't think those comparisons are exactly accurate, I do think we see in this moment that the protest around racial injustice is being answered in some of the same ways in the 1960s, that it's a matter of inclusion in corporate entities, it's about markets, instead of really thinking about the public good and the ways that the state has failed Black America. And this isn't simply a time in which Black America needs more marketing or more opportunities for wealth building at the expense of the most marginalized.
It might be useful at this point to have a look at a couple of tweets. One from the McDonald's Twitter account, a tweet that is embedded in your article, cleverly entitled "A Silver Lining for the Golden Arches in Black America." Your article was published in the Boston Globe last June, and the McDonald's tweet was posted earlier in that month, just after the killing of George Floyd. And then we'll have a look at a second tweet, also embedded in your article, that had been posted 2 years earlier on the Fight for 15 Twitter account. That is, Fight for $15 an hour minimum wage. So first, the tweet from the McDonald's account, and I will read it aloud as it's displayed for those who are just getting audio with us. So let's have that now. They were one of us: Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Alton Sterling, Botham Jean, Tatiana Jefferson, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd. He was one of us. She was one of us. They were all one of us. We see them in our customers. We see them in our crew members. We see them in our franchises. And this is why the entire McDonald's family grieves. It's why we stand for them and any other victims of systemic oppression and violence. Today we stand with Black communities across America, which is why we're donating to the National Urban League and the NAACP. We do not tolerate inequity, injustice, or racism. Black lives matter. Now the tweet from the Fight for 15 account.
What's up, Jake? What up? Where's Cap? At the J.O.B., man. What?
McDonald's failure to raise our wages is proof that it's a company that doesn't care about its workers like me and you. We suffer wage theft, sexual harassment, retaliation, unsafe work conditions, and now we have to face more of the dirty lies McDonald's is telling us. When will this stop?
No benefits at all, or either it takes out too much out of our checks, and we barely make ends meet as it is.
The most I've made was $11.50 at one McDonald's, which was decent to me for the hours I make. But now I'm getting paid less money to do more work at other McDonald's, and I'm not liking it.
What McDonald's is doing it's unacceptable, because we should make more than what we're making. We should make 15. That's why I'm fighting for 15 an hour, and we just don't, and they don't appreciate us. The management is bad. They talk to us however they want, and that's not cool at all.
Because I want to send a message that people like me, 40 years old, shouldn't have to live with poverty wages.
I don't care, because I'm going to keep doing it. If I sit down again, they're going to have to keep giving me ticket after ticket after ticket until I feel like I'm satisfied, until I feel like my daughter going to get what she wants to deserve, until I feel like every working parent, mother, father, grandmother, whoever, until we get what we want and what we need and what we deserve, I'm going to keep on protesting so the police won't have to keep on arresting me. So what?
Marcia, could you tell us something about why you embedded these tweets in your article and what you did with these tweets in your discussion? Yeah.
Absolutely. So after the killing of George Floyd and the commencing of what I call the George Floyd summer, a number of institutions, from corporations, colleges and universities, sports teams, you name it, issued these statements about Black Lives Matter. And I think it was interesting for some people who aren't familiar with the history of these kind of corporate gestures to try to see if we were in a moment that was radically different or how to make sense of it. And when I saw McDonald's tweeting out Black Lives Matter, I thought it was interesting because my book actually starts in earnest in 1968 after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And in that moment, McDonald's was trying to mitigate a tension between its white franchise owners who are doing business in Black communities and a general sense after April 1968 that corporate America and banks and colleges and universities had to do more to respond to African American grievances. And their solution was to bring African Americans into fast food franchising. And the rest is history, because they discovered that these Black franchise owners could really capitalize on the fewer and fewer commercial options in Black neighborhoods. They were able to create a really loyal Black consumer base, and this is kind of where we are today. But McDonald's tweet was really fascinating to me because they had included the line that they were giving money to the NAACP and Urban League, but they have been making charitable donations to these organizations and other Black civil rights organizations for more than 5 decades. That was their strategy to make inroads in Black communities, not just as an opportunity for Black franchise owners, but to get Black customers. They gave money to the United Negro College Fund, and through their incredible network of Black franchise owners, they were regularly underwriting activities in Black communities and making these types of donations. And so I thought it was really interesting, the number of people who thought that McDonald's had made this kind of turn in their own sensibilities. But in fact, this is how McDonald's operates. It is constantly ingratiating itself to Black communities through cultural work and through philanthropy. And in this moment, the spin was that they had been kind of brought to consciousness because of Black Lives Matter. And in addition, one of the issues that happens when any institution says, okay, we stand in solidarity to Black Lives Matter, is that the terms of the conversation shift. And so now organizations like Fight for 15 can use McDonald's own words against it. If Black Lives Matter, then why are you allowing for franchisees to abuse workers? After COVID emerged, McDonald's created these commercials that said, we're giving paid sick leave. But if you read the very fine print at the bottom of that announcement, paid sick leave was only available to employees of McDonald's corporate-owned stores. That represents fewer than 10% of all its restaurants. And so the ways that McDonald's came into the Black community after 1968 on the coattails of King's assassination and spun it as their desire to do the right thing in a moment of racial reckoning, they're doing it again. But I think that this time around, they're not going to be trusted and they're not going to be embraced in the same way because we have 5+ decades of these worker tensions of mostly Black and brown workers within the McDonald's system.
Very interesting. Could we go back to the Black capitalism initiatives in 1968 after the assassination of Martin Luther King? And this is in your account. A number of the icons of the African American civil rights movement of the 1960s, again by your own account, seem to sign on to the Black capitalism project. I mean, people like Jesse Jackson, who talked about what he called silver rights, meaning economic rights in addition to civil rights. Or Julian Bond, who I think, as in your account, was involved also in Black capitalist initiatives. Now, for these figures, capitalism could be an instrument of empowerment as well as exploitation. And there would seem to be a certain kind of, correct me if I'm wrong about this, certain realism lying behind this view. And that is to say, look, McDonald's is a reality. Whatever you want to say about it, it's out there, it's a powerful institution. Given that reality, all things being equal, the more Black owners and managers, the better for the Black community. More generally in this account, capitalism is a reality. If you want power, you have to be part of that reality. Capitalism is an engine that pulls people, this is according to this account now, please understand. It's an engine that pulls people out of poverty, and the engineers driving the engine, people in business when they're successful, become the wielders of both economic and political power. If African Americans want full equality in our society, then they've got to get a proportionate piece of the economic action. Yes, capitalism can exploit, but it can also empower. What better way, again, thinking along the lines of the way people were thinking then, what better way to Black empowerment than social investment in Black businesses, Black capitalism, Black enterprise zones or empowerment zones in struggling Black communities? Businesses owned by African Americans, managed by African Americans, with African American workers operating productively, perhaps first in African American communities and then more widely. I mean, in general terms, this seems like a reasonable position which people like Jesse Jackson and Julian Bond sort of signed on to. I mean, where did it go wrong exactly in your account?
Well, I think the first thing that's important to understand, and I think you summed it up perfectly, is that this idea that African American economic power could translate into political and social power has very long and deep roots in the United States, all the way to the 19th century. And if you look at figures like Booker T. Washington or Madam C.J. Walker, they all believe that business enterprise could not just enhance their communities, but I think that there's also another motivation that's far more poignant, that the more capital that an individual or a community amasses, the more and more you can distance yourself from the humiliation of racial capitalism. And there are all of these kind of examples of wealthy African Americans who are able to bring tailors and costumers inside their home so they don't have to deal with the indignities of Jim Crow and not being allowed to try on a suit or a dress. You have the stories of someone like Booker T. Washington, who has, I believe, Andrew Carnegie create his own train car, so he never has to be subject to the indignities of separate but equal. And so in some ways, the idea that investing in McDonald's entry into the Black community could help Black people is something that I understand that perspective. But what I take umbrage with is that when that is grafted on to, for instance, Dr. King's legacy, we have some problems here because if you, and I've been telling everyone to do this, do yourself a favor and go on YouTube and listen 45 minutes to Dr. Martin Luther King's last oration, April 3rd, 1968 at Mason's Temple in Memphis. And he talks about kind of the history of human progress. And he talks about the economic boycotts and the importance of Black buying power. He isn't suggesting that Black buying power is the power in and of itself. he says that we have to engage in economic boycott so that we're all feeling the pain, so that we're in solidarity with the workers that he had gone to visit in Memphis. And so what I think happened in this moment of Black capitalism in the 1960s is that you have these different forces that are making a case for capitalism from a position of either exhaustion. So people who had been involved in civil rights activism had seen these incredible legislative shifts in the 1960s, but it didn't change the quality of Black life. And so in some ways, it was kind of an abandonment of the idealism of beloved community. For others, the move towards capitalism was about consolidating power on the terms of the kind of American economic system that was not going to bend to the calls for desegregation. And this is where you get people like Richard Nixon, who is no friend of civil rights, but he is invested in the idea of Black capitalism because the entire premise is predicated on segregation. And so while he's fighting busing, while he's destabilizing Black radical groups, while he is gutting the social safety net and bringing the new federalism to the United States, he's saying, we want to put money into Black businesses. We want to put money in Black businesses because they're confined in Black communities. And so I think that what I show in the book and what I've been really reflecting on is just that I think it's completely natural and normal for people to change their position on how change will come. But I think we always have to be incredibly vigilant that this comes at a very high price. Capitalism is not designed for everyone to be a winner. It's just not. And so if we are going to contend with the excesses of capitalism, then we have to be very clear about the role that business shouldn't have in society. And, my position in writing this book about McDonald's, people say, oh, did you write a takedown of McDonald's? And I said, no, this book is an analysis of the constrained choices that African Americans are forced to make because they are separated from their rights as citizens, and then they're separated from the kinds of state-based investments that allow people to have economic security and as many options as possible for themselves and for their communities.
So in that analysis, are you suggesting that capitalism is intrinsically exploitative, such that we really do need to move away from it in a radical kind of way? And by the way, in that spirit, I'm recalling here one of your reviewers, a guy named Parker Daniel on Booklist, who says, your approach in the book is an arguably Marxist perspective. I mean, what would you say about that characterization of your approach?
I think that's right. I mean, I think that, having kind of myself grown up in, the Catholic social justice world, having grown up in Chicago, where there is a deep concentration of, I think, very earnest and very thoughtful African Americans in the franchising industry, as well as within the executive core of McDonald's, people who have been able to build incredible careers for themselves and elevate themselves from working in middle class to financial stability. I get it. And at the same time, I think we have to take into account what happens when we look to corporations and we look at their output as the source of stabilizing the problems of state abandonment. And so I'm not going to, yes, I take a Marxist approach in the sense that if we start to believe that any corporation, any business, any social responsibility plan can supplant the responsibilities of the state, then we've really given up on the idea of the common good and the public good. And so what I chronicle in the book is this shift from McDonald's being this place of exclusion for African American consumers to a place where African American consumers are depending on McDonald's for things that McDonald's should never provide. McDonald's should not be the singular source of the summer jobs program for kids. It shouldn't be the only place where senior citizens can gather and see their friends. It shouldn't be the only safe playground in a community. And it should not be underwriting historically Black colleges and universities. we actually have a robust system in order to make sure people get their needs met, and it's called taxes. And if we put pressure on corporations to pay their fair share, then we don't get into these moral and ethical dilemmas about whether a corporation is supporting Black Lives Matter or Fight for 15 or paid sick leave. These need to be embedded in our society, and McDonald's should just stick to hamburger. They are not in the business of social justice because no business is in that business. And so I think that when you look at vulnerable communities like African American communities, especially in the post 68 climate, they were being offered a version of the American dream that was underwritten by corporations that ultimately would not have their best interests at heart, because corporations are not in the business of the care of society. And I think that we have lived in a moment of so much corporate underwriting, so much being primed to think about corporate social responsibility as an act of benevolence, that we forget that we actually have the capacity to care for our neighbor, and that is through collective resources.
But is there a way of acknowledging the importance of the state in rectifying social injustices, redistribution practices, and that kind of thing, and at the same time appreciate, at least at a certain level, the contribution that corporations might make to social life? Another thing that comes to mind here is another reviewer of the book. This is Michael Fletcher in the Washington Post review of your book. He is, by the way, African American. He writes for ESPN. He says this: in her telling, fast food corporations, short-sighted civil rights leaders, politicians, the government, and unwitting Black capitalists conspire to saturate Black communities with fast food, imperiling Black health. That is certainly one take, he says. Maybe the problem, though, is not the presence of too many fast food restaurants in Black communities, but the absence of so many other businesses and institutions. And I think what he has in mind is something like the fact that that corporations can provide certain goods that are very, very important to the development of various communities. So even though you might acknowledge that there are mixed motivations, McDonald's and other corporations, they're out to make profits. It is in their interest in some sense to make available benefits of various kinds, scholarships, charitable contributions. It's part of the marketing thing, of course, but it also has a good effect. One thing that really kind of jumped out at me in your book, in the acknowledgments in your own book, you talked about how you came to write the book, and you said, and here I'm quoting, "If I had to sum up the origins of this project, I'd say it began with my participation in a Black history-themed quiz bowl, Know Your Heritage, in my sophomore year at St. Ignatius College Prep in Chicago. Broadcast on a local TV station and hosted by ABC 7 news anchor Jim Rose, Know Your Heritage was aired during Black History Month. The show and our prizes were underwritten by the Black McDonald's Operators Association in Chicago and Northwestern Indiana." Now, please understand, I'm not suggesting that there was this grand benevolent project that motivating this, but it was a good in some sense that happened, and there are other goods like that that McDonald's makes available. So, I mean, is there a space in your account which expresses a certain kind of acknowledgement or appreciation or recognition of the fact that there are these goods that capitalism can provide, however the motivations might be mixed? The motivations are mixed in government too. People are trying to get elected and they're appealing to constituencies and so forth. Is there anything in your account which would say, yeah, there is something there? And therefore, the Marxist critique would have to be qualified to some degree. That is to say, it's not simply a matter of exploitation. It's a matter of mutual interest somehow being generated and satisfied in a complex social process. I'm just wondering how you would react to any of that.
Well, my response to that would be the terms in which we are qualifying the good, I think, is the part that troubles me. So I acknowledge in the book that for African Americans of a generation where they're given the opportunity to enter franchising, that they come with a real spirit of hopefulness, that this is not, this dastardly plot to imperil Black America. From the perspective of 1969, a McDonald's in your neighborhood was a sign of hope. And I write that in the book. And I talk about the Black franchisees who were really pillars in their community. My concern is that this prosperity or this opportunity is predicated on systems of oppression that never allow for real liberation. And so I think that I can acknowledge that, philanthropy has enriched the quality of my life, that the generosity of others is something that is really moving. But the types of things that we are lauding corporations for doing, they always give me pause because I think, well, surely there's another way we can get these needs met. When we talk about college scholarships, well, maybe this is an argument for college being free. And if we talk about, charitable donations for instance, the McDonald's franchisees have created an incredible resource with the Ronald McDonald House. But I think that makes us take a step back and say, when a family has a sick child, why do they need a corporation to underwrite free housing? Shouldn't we have a system for that? And while we're at it, what about healthcare? And so I think what I am always really concerned about are the terms in which we start to believe that the wealth of corporations is what allows us to live a good quality life. Because we see what happens when we have economic instability like we have right now with COVID, that these are not dependable sources for the common good. And so if McDonald's is in their if we lived in a world where basic needs are met, then McDonald's can have promotions on cheeseburgers. Maybe they can sponsor, an appearance of Ronald McDonald. These are not things that are fundamental to the state. But I do have a lot of mixed emotions that my first serious engagement with African American history had to happen in this extracurricular mechanism that a group of Black franchise owners were nice enough to create for high school students, instead of living in a world where I learned African American history at my school. And so I think that when we are always kind of tethered to the actions of the corporation, this is what makes me shudder. And the analysis that the reviewer in the Washington Post, you can never understand tone from writing, but yeah, I agree. The problem is, it's not that there are not enough businesses. There's not enough state intervention in the lives of vulnerable people. And, that's kind of my position. And I think that if we are presented a choice, if maybe we have fewer consumer choices or a different consumer marketplace that can guarantee that, people in America don't perish without proper health care, or that we can have free college and we can have these other things, then I think that's a pretty exciting possibility that we need to explore.
Fast forwarding to the present, from the 1960s, could the same critique you offer of McDonald's be offered against, say, the NBA's one playoff game strike in response to the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin? At one point you say, I think in the Silver Lining article, this is not about the NBA, you say, in the decades following this experiment in supporting Black-owned franchises, McDonald's has held fast to the narrative that its infiltration into Black communities was an act of conscience rather than one of capitalism. So in your view, was the NBA's support of the Black community about marketing essentially, or about conscience, or both?
So I think what happens in these institutions of people of conscience are within it, right? So when McDonald's went into Black neighborhoods in 1968, they did it because their white franchise owners didn't want to be there anymore. So they were facilitating a kind of economic white flight that they made profitable. And they were Black franchise owners who were of deep passion and conviction for helping Black communities that saw this as a vehicle. So I think two things can exist at the same time. The NBA protests, I think, are a good example of a group of mostly African American employees in a company that are growing into political awareness, and they're trying to see kind of who they can be politically in the context of their work. You know, as people who work on college campuses, we see this with our students. I think it's a really powerful, you know, display of a kind of political maturity that they're all trying to kind of understand. I think the players of the WNBA have really demonstrated that over the years. And so I support and I appreciate what the NBA players were doing. I think that the NBA as a structure, you know, they're a smart business that's been able to sustain themselves for a long time by taking the temperature. I think this is the thing that people lose sight of in these moments. So when Nike supports Colin Kaepernick, when McDonald's tweets out Black Lives Matter, when the NBA says, you know, we're going to support this wildcat strike for a day, these decisions are not just kind of visceral reactions. They have a clear understanding of their consumer and their market base. And so I can probably bet you, you know, dollars to donuts that the Nike had very good market research on who buys their products, what's the long-term relationship with that consumer market before they supported Colin Kaepernick. These decisions are never made in a vacuum. And in the same ways that McDonald's understood that they were trying to maintain businesses in cities that had become predominantly Black, they didn't want to be targets of animus during uprisings. And they knew the Nixon administration also had to kind of find a place around the race problem. And they saw the big banks doing this. They saw the other institutions doing this. And so I think that these decisions are very much informed from various places, even if the people within the system are really operating from the heart and the gut.
All right. So am I hearing you say then that whatever you want to say about the individuals, say within the NBA or the WNBA and so forth, there is a certain kind of corporate dimension related to marketing with respect to the corporations, what they've decided to do. Are you troubled by then the NBA's marketing, the NFL's marketing? The commissioner of the NFL just turned around and said, well, we need to support Kaepernick in ways that we have not done earlier, and my consciousness has been raised. And so, yeah, exactly. Well, no, right, but then my point is this: are you troubled by that in the way you're troubled by the McDonald's corporate initiatives?
I'm troubled by it all because it's so demeaning. It's so demeaning, I think, to the people of, you know, kind of good intentions who are fighting the good fight. I understand that companies have to stay open and they're going to pursue the strategies they're going to pursue. But I think that the kind of inconsistency of practice is really upsetting. And I also think that one of the things that we're also experiencing, and this is perhaps a version of what people in 1968 felt, is that we're in a time where the political polarization is heightened by the fact that we have the capacity, just by owning a telephone, to chronicle who we are and who we were during one of the most significant periods of the 21st century. And that there's a deep desire for people to express, you know, how they felt in 2020, who they voted for, what did they support, what did they not tolerate. And so I think that kind of heightens also our sensibilities about disclosure, about making statements, whether you're just one person on Twitter or you're a major multinational corporation. But I think at the end of the day, this type of behavior is not new on the part of corporations. And the shape-shifting it is consistent. And this is what they have to do to survive. In the same ways that the McDonald's brothers closed the first McDonald's and they reoriented the kitchen, they took stuff off the menu to enhance their profits and create the system that we know today, they did that for a reason, right? And so in similar ways, there is an understanding about the changing racial demographics of this country and the changing expectations of younger consumers. And companies are doing that. And they're going to do that. And that's what they do. But as people in communities, as everyday people, we also have the capacity to push back and challenge and demand different things. And so I think that we are just engaged in another turn of this great dance between the expectations of a political economy in which capital will always leverage its resources to consolidate its power, and then people who are saying that we need to take a moment to stop this process and really discern what's right for the greater good. And that fight will continue. And so, I'm glad that McDonald's believes that Black Lives Matter. I have a whole bunch of things that they could do to really make that fine point, but they haven't asked me.
Interesting. On more generally the issue of the relationship between McDonald's and generating genuine or authentic community, really supporting community in authentic ways. If we could just return to Chris Arnardi's vision of McDonald's in his book Dignity, Seeking Respect in Back Row America. Just a quick description of what he's about there. I'd like to get you don't talk about this in your book, but I'd like to get your reaction to this. By back row America, Arnardi means those parts of America that have been left behind economically, culturally, socially, politically by what he calls front row America. And in his account, McDonald's, he gives almost a kind of anthropological account of this. McDonald's offers a welcoming environment, he says, for the downtrodden, the homeless, the dispossessed, the vulnerable, a decimated underclass that cuts across racial lines, black, brown, white, what have you. Arnardi visited a number of places across the country and became friends with members of this disadvantaged class, and he would ask where he should meet them to talk. And they typically said at McDonald's. And I quote from his book, he says, McDonald's was a space where they could be themselves on their own terms. It was a place to momentarily escape the drama and chaos of the streets, a place that allowed them to rejoin society on the same terms as everyone else. And he goes on to say that McDonald's lacked the quiet or not so quiet judgment of these people that they would find in other places like public parks or nonprofit organizations, interestingly enough. And Marcia, I know someone very close to me, who has struggled for years with mental illness. And after years of living on the streets of New York, Boston, and Rhode Island, that person is currently in a stable, assisted living environment and now calls the local McDonald's his second home. There he's been accepted and welcomed and warmly received without reservation by management, including black management in certain moments of the history of that particular place, and workers and patrons. And until COVID-19 has spent a good part of his day every day at McDonald's for many years. So if the author Chris Arnardi is right, this kind of welcoming of folks down on their luck is a feature of the everyday McDonald's community in different parts of the country. And he's not, by the way, he's not a shill for McDonald's. He's an ordinary guy who went out there and did some research. But McDonald's is a kind of haven, a kind of oasis for those who've left behind in society. You don't have that kind of snooty judgment of these people going on in McDonald's in the way in other places. I'm just wondering, how do you react to that vision of McDonald's, which is a very different sort of vision than the one you depict, say, as when you depict it as a successful capitalistic enterprise that's often exploited vulnerable communities for profit and so forth. I mean, how would you react to this other kind of way of thinking about this?
Well, I would say it's definitely a case of both and it's one of these places that encapsulates a duality. So while it's a place of haven and support for people who, he describes at the margins, for the workers there, I don't know if they would say that, right? But that's not always necessarily true. When I was interviewing a woman who had worked at McDonald's as a manager, she talked about having this great experience as a Black woman in the food service industry, having a hard time being employed by white franchise owners. And she worked at a Black-owned franchise in Dallas. And she really, I think in the depths of her heart felt like, what a great opportunity I have to hire people who have felony convictions, who may not get another chance, to be a person in the community who's giving people this start. And I applaud that. And I don't like the fact that it occurs in the context of a private business, that at the end of the day, if there is a change in ownership, if there's a change in management, people are made more vulnerable. So it's not the fact that McDonald's can serve in these ways. It's the absence of state-run facilities and infrastructure that can provide this for people that concerns me, because I also know that for others, McDonald's is a place where there's a lot of police activity. There's a lot of cracking down on the homeless. Depending on the circumstances, it's a place where policies about loitering, time limits on how long you can sit there. Sometimes it's a place where teenagers are harassed by the police. So I think it can be both of these things, but it's because it can be both of these things and its murkiness that I want us to take a step back and say, what are the contingencies that have to be in place in order for McDonald's to provide this kind of space for a person? And what can we do to remove this, if this happens, then this happens kind of culture, to say, well, why don't we just have resources that are just available to people? And I think that you're right. I think that McDonald's can be a place of refuge and great joy and pleasure. And I don't want to strip that away from anyone. Fast food is delicious. It tastes good, and when like in the context I grew up in, when you're young, it's exciting to go to. It's a place to hang out with your friends. You can meet up and go to the movies. I completely understand it from the most personal perspective of the possibilities of McDonald's. But I don't want McDonald's to serve such important needs in the lives of people, because I think this is where we stop having a vision of how we can take care of each other, and then we defer the responsibility for care or for oversight onto McDonald's, and it's not okay. And I think it is important for their spaces for people who have been, because of classism and racism, find a place, but I want it to be a place where they can just be, not a place where there has to be money exchanged, or that you can be subject to harassment, or that you can be subject to removal because you're on the outside. And so I think that the complexity of what McDonald's does in people's lives is the part that has always made me intellectually curious, not only about McDonald's, but the fast food industry broadly defined.
Do you think that Arnade gives you a kind of overly romantic depiction of communal life in relationship to McDonald's?
I don't, because I think that the depiction is based on the experiences of people within a very specific context. But I think that when you take a step back, your question always has to remain, why at McDonald's? And what are the needs that are not being met by this community being forged in the context of McDonald's? It's this thing that I often mention. I'm of a generation kind of pre-internet in my growing up. And, increasingly, I try to think about a context in which you don't have to engage with a market in order to be connected, a no money required kind of term. And so when I think about, when you want to meet with someone, you say, let's meet for coffee. The fact that you can always be in this purchasing relationship with people in order to be near them is something that concerns me. And so I don't think it's rose-colored glasses to say that McDonald's is a force of galvanizing people. But again, I want people to be in community centers and public libraries and places where they can eat for free and be together for free, more so than hoping that an individual fast food outlet will be nice to a group of people, because they're not required to, and because it's not being supported by a structure. It's being supported by individuals who were kind that day, that week, that month, or that year.
Thank you. I think now's the time for us to move to general Q&A. And I think we're going to start out with a couple of questions from two faculty members at St. Olaf College, both of the religion department at St. Olaf, Anthony Bateza and Timothy Rainey. And so we'll start with Professor Bateza's question.
Hello, Dr. Chatelain. My name is Anthony Bateza, and I teach here at St. Olaf in the religion department and in race and ethnic studies. I want to say I really appreciated your work as a whole, and particularly the reference you make to the movie Coming to America towards the middle of the book. I liked how you point out that the film, as it presents the characters and the plot, is able to ignore the challenges and responsibilities of Black-owned fast food establishments. That it sidesteps the larger systemic issues facing a franchisee. But I want to ask a question related to some other issues that come out of the film, I think, and relate to your work. The film, I think, also ignores some of Cleo McDowell's views about capitalism, the sort of bootstrapping he seems to embody, where one week you're mopping floors and next week it's the fries, onward and upward you will climb. Additionally, McDowell seems to have a strong sense in the film of his own superiority, or at least the inferiority or lack of suitability of poor Blacks as spouses, partners, and close friends to him now that he has arrived, so to speak. So I'm wondering, to what extent does the ascendancy of a Black middle class help or hinder the work for equity or social justice? Are there problems with exceptionalism, with a politics of respectability among Black leaders in business, the academy, or other stratified areas? Or alternatively, would you say that attending to these kinds of problems is actually a distraction from the larger structural and systemic cooperation between racism and capitalism seen in McDonald's and across America? So, any thoughts or reflections you have on this would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Marcia?
What a great question. First of all, you've engaged my favorite movie, Coming to America, with so much dexterity. I appreciate it. I was just watching it a few days ago. The first thing that I would say, I love this movie because John Amos is in it, and he was actually the first African-American to ever be in a McDonald's commercial. And I was listening to an interview with him where McDonald's offered him royalty to reissue the commercial, and he talked about how he used it, I think, to pay for his son to go to film school. So I love the layers of that. So there's something about the ascendancy narrative of African-American franchise owners that I think we have to be very careful with. The ad that opened up the Fight for 15 montage was the Calvin ads, which were a series of ads from the early 1990s that talk about this young man who we are supposed to assume is from the streets. He goes to McDonald's for some discipline, and he moves up to manager, and then his community says one day he'll be a franchise owner. And this is a narrative of progress that is often presented as a possibility. Among the small group of Black franchise owners, a very small number of them have ascended from being a crew member all the way to an operator. You have to have a lot of wealth, and you have to have the capacity to get a lot of assistance, both legally and financially, in order to be a franchise owner. So that is also a myth. But I think that there's something that happens within the context of McDonald's that is an important point to some of the issues raised in your question. And that is the ways that in moments like 2020 or 1968, when we think about the problems that arise after major uprisings, the terms of the issues in which people take to the streets to protest are always very clear, and they've been clear for about a century. Police brutality, lack of jobs, problems with quality of schools for Black children, lack of business resources. And what's interesting is that the business part tends to be the one that the state and other entities will try to think about, and they ignore the other three that I would argue are more pressing. And so in the diversity and inclusion moments that we find ourselves in, a lot of the opportunity is geared towards white collar professionals and middle class people at the exclusion of the poor. So if McDonald's really was motivated by 1968, then they wouldn't go out and recruit Black franchise owners. They would improve the quality of life for the Black working class. The majority of the Black and brown people who work for or at a McDonald's are crew operators. They're not franchisees. But what will happen is that you will see these diversity initiatives that talk about McDonald's being one of the most diverse companies in the corporate level, but they're talking about attorneys, accountants. There have been negotiations that McDonald's has entered with the NAACP to deposit more money in Black-owned banks, to hire more Black-owned creative firms. And while these investments are good, they're not bad, they don't necessarily trickle down to the most vulnerable. And so I think that there's a way where a lot of these initiatives are geared towards the Cleo McDowells, people who are of a certain class position at the exclusion of the people who are really harmed. We see this in colleges and universities all the time. They respond to the moment with the institutionalization of African American studies, which is important, which I support. They might open up more scholarship opportunities, but they will not provide any kind of relief to the Black and brown kitchen workers or groundskeepers because they don't matter within the configuration of creating opportunity. And so I think that your analysis is very thoughtful, because I do think that there is a class tension in these moments in which we see an encouragement for the amplification of Black voices, but they rarely include improving the quality of Black working class life.
Thank you, Marcia. Now a question from Timothy Rainey, faculty member in the Religion Department.
Dr. Chatelain, thank you for this wonderful book and for being here with us at St. Olaf. Franchise is an incredibly enlightening book that brings together matters of food justice, racial uplift, politics, corporations, and this interesting category called Black capitalism. And my question sits somewhere in the middle of all of these things. So I would love to hear you say more about the kind of cultural capital that corporations manufacture and cash in on in various ways. Increasingly, branding includes more than the promotion of a business's product, but also this kind of goodness possessed of the institution itself, or we can even think in terms of how this sort of projection of moral and ethical interest gets pumped into the public sphere. And of course, such campaigns are often larger than actual measures taken to address matters of health, sustainability, and inequality. And I'm wondering, in the case of McDonald's, if you were able to learn much about the ways this chain thinks about their numbers when it comes to outreach, or that percentage of their business committed to charitable work. And then for you, do cultures of charitableness relate in any way to the dispossession of capital we find within particular communities?
Marcia?
Ooh, what an intriguing question. So I think what we see with McDonald's is a very interesting kind of, I won't call it a bait and switch, but I think it's a lack of clarity of terms. So when we talk about McDonald's, there is a corporation called McDonald's that depends on the work of its franchisees in order to, kind of bolster the company. And also McDonald's owns a lot of real estate. People say that McDonald's is a real estate company that offers hamburgers. This is important because recent lawsuits on behalf of 52 Black franchise owners against McDonald's alleged that McDonald's engaged in practices of racial discrimination that imperiled their capacity to earn and to perform like their white colleagues. And I think that this is important because it's a very good example about the ways that wealth does not necessarily insulate African Americans from the consequences of racism, regardless of where they sit. When I first started writing franchise, I came upon a case of an African American man who had claimed McDonald's had redlined him out of the suburbs. And this is something that comes up in a lot of the ways that franchise owners talk about McDonald's. They talk about it in terms very similar to real estate. And so he didn't have the opportunity to expand in white areas. And because he was in a predominantly Black part of Los Angeles, his security costs, his insurance costs were higher. When I came upon this case in the NAACP records, I thought to myself, why is this guy appealing to the NAACP for help? He's not an aggrieved party. He's not a child who's trying to go to a desegregated school, and he's not someone who was discriminated out of a bank loan. Like, why should we care? But I increasingly understood something about the nature of civil rights. It's for everybody. And that the wealthy and the powerful often use the courts to litigate their grievances. And so it was this really kind of both poignant and also complicated ways that he was an aggrieved Black millionaire who still had a very legitimate claim of racial discrimination. And this reminds us about how the power of racism operates, that it can never kind of be squelched by the kind of wealth and power that people have. And so these narratives about racial discrimination within corporations are often responded to with, look at all this opportunity that we give, as if that is the only way in which racism can ever be eradicated. And we know that that's not true. In a country that has had a Black president and now has a president that has so embraced racism and indulges in it at every turn, like we know that these types of things don't necessarily lead to another. And so I think that what McDonald's has done very successfully is using the cultural, social, and political capital of its Black franchise owners to stand in for its own practices. Because when you parse out the difference between McDonald's and its franchisees, some interesting things happen. A lot of the kind of charitable acts that are done within Black communities are paid for by franchise owners, not McDonald's corporate. If you look at the ways that that McDonald's kind of fights calls, like the Fight for 15, is that they'll say, well, we're not the employer, your franchisee is, which the National Labor Relations Board has made different decisions on. Both pro franchise owner is an employee, pro it's not. But all of this is to say that, you know, McDonald's really does depend on the incredible power Black franchise owners have in their community because of the compression of resources and opportunities in Black community to suggest something about itself that I don't think is entirely illustrative of how it operates as a business. And so I think that this is one of the ways in which the sleight of hand of capitalism creates a lot of dis-ease in us, because we do see the charitable work and we do see the wealthy franchise owners, but what we're not able to see so clearly are the poverty wages of the workers who have to fuel this incredible supply chain of food and the real consequences of how this wealth is generated.
Thank you, Marcia. Now we have some questions from St. Olaf students.
When analyzing McDonald's intriguing interactions with Black communities across the United States, from participating in segregationist policies in Jim Crow South to their celebration of Black culture with programs like 365 Black, which is more important to you, impact or intent?
Oh, this is a good one. I don't know how to answer that question. I would say that the most important thing to me is history and context. And so I think that we have to allow for both understandings, that the intent of McDonald's entering Black communities is to make lots of money, but the impact can be complicated and multifaceted. And so I want to say something about that question, because I think it bridges a lot of issues that have come up when I talk about this. Is that, you know, when I was on my book tour before COVID hit, I went to Kansas City, Missouri, and a woman talked about going to McDonald's for the first time and getting ice cream. And she was an older African-American woman, and she talked about how awesome that was because she had lived in a context of Jim Crow segregation, and her grandmother never let them go have ice cream because she didn't want them to use a colored window, right? And then she remembers when McDonald's came into her community and it was Black owned, and she went on a date and it was very exciting. And so I never want to discredit or degrade the very real and powerful experiences people have in the marketplace. One of the things that I always want to do is to say the marketplace can create all of these pleasures and all of these exciting experiences, and capitalism can indulge all sorts of desires, but it will always leave us feeling a little empty. And that's what it's designed to do. And so while I think that the impact is so important, I think that history allows us to understand context and to better analyze intent.
Your book talks about the relationship between McDonald's and Black communities and how it's both empowerment and exploitation. My question for you is, do you think we should, and if yes, how can we be anti-capitalist in the current times?
Oh, wow. This is something that is a struggle, I think, for everyone. I think if we are taking very serious, Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist has really helped people kind of shift their thinking about anti-racism, which I think is important. But I think that we need to pair that with anti-capitalism in ways that are manageable for our everyday lives in order to grow in our capacity to fight these systems. So you always ask twice, why am I consuming something? Do I need to consume it? who's harmed in the consumption of it. But I also think that we need to start thinking about our ability in communities to solve problems. If there was a problem in your neighborhood and you think about who you should call for support, I think that this is always a good civics lesson. Who's being elected? What are the processes of public service? Like what are the mechanisms and routes for you to make change in your communities, and not to simply say, I will write a grant to try to make this change, or I'll see if this company wants to pitch in, or I'll try to pressure this business. I think that economic activism has always been so important. It was so important in the civil rights movement. But I think as I spend more and more time with Dr. King's, last few years of his life, these conversations about anti-poverty and anti-capitalism were very much informed by this idea that the place in which we care for each other is community, and that no corporation is motivated to do that. And so how do we put pressure on the institutions that generate and exploit people for capital? How do we at least advocate for the candidates and the policies that make sure that they're cared for while they're doing this? I mean, this is like the bare minimum. This isn't radical kind of Marxist thinking. It's just, how do we make sure that people are able to survive while they're working and they're providing, and then we move from there.
Hi, my name is Ben Stile, and my question regards the role that McDonald's plays in pursuing policy, specifically economic justice. As a business, I think McDonald's has an interest in providing good food to its customers, good jobs to its workers, and good returns to its shareholders. And I'm wondering why they should have a vested interest in pursuing policy versus the government, and why McDonald's should be playing a role in pursuing things other than what their company is supposed to do. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they should be subject to policies that require justice for their workers and for their suppliers. Unfortunately, we know that we live in a context in which our political system has all sorts of interest groups that make a case for their own interest. And increasingly, we see what happens when there aren't enough people advocating for the poor and the vulnerable. COVID-19 has been such a disaster and has been so tragic, but what it allows us to see is a different prism in which inequality can be really, really understood and studied, and the vulnerability of people in America. And so McDonald's has the capacity to do quite a bit through its lobbying, through its employment of former public officials, through its various campaigns, whether it's about trying to stop some of the measures that keep fast food out of schools and hospitals, whether it's not supporting the raising of the federal minimum wage, whether it is obstructing the idea of healthcare for all. They're at the forefront of all of it because they know that at the at the end of the day, it's their bottom line. And so we have a system in which corporations can engage the imaginations of our lawmakers. And so perhaps this is a time to think about, how do we put limits, or how do we even put guardrails on this process to make sure that people aren't rendered so disposable. And so I think that I'm okay living in a world where hamburger companies only sell hamburger, that they don't advocate for policies, that they don't, they're not responsible for creating curriculum guides, that they don't do anything but provide a juicy hamburger for people to consume. And that we have a society in which the state determines how much people make an hour at the very least, and what healthcare benefits they have, and the fact that they can have childcare for their kids at work. Like, I think that that's something that, we should start really considering as a possibility, because I think if COVID has taught us anything, is that we're all precarious in this country. There is no social safety net, and that each and every one of us, Annalise Orlick has a book called "We Are All Fast Food Workers Now," and the ability to kind of degrade the quality of work and our life as workers is something that I think we all should be vigilant about, not just people making an hourly wage.
Hi, my name is Kamaya and I'm a junior here at St. Olaf, and I just had a question about what caused the shift from McDonald's being an elitist place to being more a place where people just went when they were hungry and had a few bucks, and was this shift caused by Black people taking over the franchises after the death of Martin Luther King?
So, people eating fast food more often is the result of a number of things. So, when McDonald's first emerged, in the 1940s and 1950s, in the types of community that it originally was in and expanded to were bedroom communities where white suburban families were slowly becoming wealthy enough to spend a little disposable income at a cheap hamburger place. This wasn't incredibly expensive, but these were not people who, um, you know, had all the wealth in the world. And so it provided something special for families. And then car culture allowed for the expansion of fast food because people were stopping and eating. What happened in the 1960s when McDonald's started to enter African American communities was that McDonald's thought of itself as an occasional meal item. And what they discovered is that in African American communities, people were consuming it multiple times a day because they had fewer options for eating out, because the food was so cheap, and because so many people were working and families didn't have the capacity to kind of convene their families for dinner. And so McDonald's saw that it could have an entire consumer market of people who just ate it all the time. In the 1970s, a big shift happened with the oil embargo crisis, where oil became very hard to find. And so gasoline was rationed for a few years in America. And as a result, families that lived in places where you had to drive to McDonald's were less likely to do it because they didn't want to waste gas. But the urban market had been a little insulated from that, and they were going to McDonald's continually throughout the 1970s. And so McDonald's realized that when you are in communities and when you cater to people who don't have lots of options, they could be the best option. And then I think the other change was change in lifestyle. People had to work multiple jobs to keep their families fed. There weren't lots of opportunities. And so McDonald's becomes this incredible convenience to feed families and to feed children because people are really busy. I know for myself, I ate a lot of McDonald's as a kid because my mom was working. I had a job at 14, 15 years old, and I could feed myself for very cheap and, keep it moving. And so I think that these are really important reflections of the changes, not only in kind of what families could do, but how squeezed they were economically and the ways that they had to depend on fast food because they both had a lack of time and a lack of money.
Thank you, Marcia. Now we have some questions that have come to us in real time during the event online. This one is from Sam Bailey, class of 2021 from St. Olaf College campus. Given your take on Black capitalism of the 1960s, I'm curious about your perspective regarding the current push for individuals to support Black-owned businesses as a form of activism. Do you think this is an acceptable and effective form of support for the Black community? Are Black-owned businesses somehow different from Black-owned McDonald's franchises? Should conscious consumers distinguish between the two?
This is an issue that plagued people in the 70s. Is going to a Black-owned McDonald's supporting a Black-owned business? And our franchise is the same. And I think that what it reveals is something that a lot of people don't realize. The amount of pressure that is placed on Black-owned businesses because they are often in hyper-segregated communities. They often are providing resources that have either been removed from the community or were never there. And so I think that, supporting Black business is a really nice gesture, but it doesn't get to the heart of the structural inequality. And so I'm always a little uncomfortable with the number of things I see about, support your Black-owned business. Black-owned restaurants are so, precarious right now. Well, they're precarious because of discrimination in bank lending, because of a lack of capital compared to white business owners, and because the fact that they're often operating in communities in which people are first hit the hardest with economic instability. And so while you're buying your takeout from a Black-owned restaurant, I want you to think about what are the resources that are not in those communities, or what are those resources not available to those businesses, and how we can remedy them. But Black-owned businesses are important culturally and socially in communities, but they do not employ tons of people. They usually are not businesses that are in a position to provide the best wages and benefits to their workers because they're so small. And so I think that we need to also think about those issues as much as I think that it's great that people want to support Black-owned businesses, but supporting business never, ever, 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 ever gets to the heart of the problem. And the problem is that these businesses have an outsized footprint in their communities because of a lack of resources and a lack of state investment.
Thank you, Marcia. This question from Sally, St. Olaf class of 1978 from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. If McDonald's stopped all its philanthropic donations and invested those monies directly in its employees, do you have an estimate on how much the hourly wage structure could be increased, or how many more employees could be provided with health insurance?
Oh, holy moly, I wish I did. That's a great way of framing it. I think I need to consult one of my friends in economics and learn some modeling. But I'll do you one better. What if there were no tax loopholes for McDonald's and they were simply charged at, a rate, let's say, of 38% or higher, and that money was put into initiatives for healthcare for all and free college and free childcare? Then we never will have to, we'd never have to take out our calculators and speculate. But the point that you make is well taken. Charitable donations are acts of kindness from the heart. They should never be structural solutions. It's like these very grim stories that you hear of, the Walmart Employees Fund, where employees of Walmart are donating to other Walmart employees during times of economic instability. There's got to be a better way.
Thank you. This from Megan Jeckott, class of 2016 from St. Paul, Minnesota. She was in my class, by the way. Hello, Megan. Just want to lift up that we wouldn't need so much philanthropy if we required corporations to pay living wages. Why pat the super wealthy on the back for giving back when their corporate control of our most relied upon systems are the reason we have such vast economic inequality, especially across race and gender?
Amen. I have, there's nothing else to say about it. And, I don't believe in punching down, and, punching up, it should only be done when necessary. But I'm afraid that we're going to live in a world in which we just don't believe in the public good, where public service is considered a joke or something to be manipulated for one's own gain. I think perhaps working at a college in Washington, D.C., I've seen such a shift in the enthusiasm my students have and the possibility of serving their country through public service. I see such burnout in my students who are working in the non-for-profit, industrial complex. And I just think that we have so much pressure put on each and every one of us that if we could imagine a world where we just take care of our basic needs together, we have no idea what our potential is, because we have been bogged down by these systems of inequality that we're either on the side of being a victim of, or we have to engage in all sorts of activities to maintain our power. And I think we're all exhausted. We've been home for 7 months. And I think that this is a wonderful time for us to think about alternative ways of ensuring our own safety and security and that of others.
Thank you, Marcia. This question from Dylan Bergerud, class of 2022 from Iterbo. That's a dorm at St. Olaf. Is $15 an hour minimum wage realistic? Will corporations raise prices in order to avoid taking corporate tax cuts?
This is a big question that, keeps on getting bandied around. And just to be very clear, $15 an hour is not enough in a lot of cities to rent a 2-bedroom apartment and work full time. And so 15 is a modest goal when we think about, housing costs in some parts of the country. People depending on who you ask, someone will tell you a different answer. The economist Robert Reich will say that raising minimum wages doesn't necessarily raise the cost of goods excessively, and that perhaps if consumers were aware of the ability for goods and services to be produced in ethical ways, they're willing to pay the money. Other people say that it would ruin businesses. I do believe that for some businesses, this may require some federal subsidies in order to raise wages. I think we have federal subsidies for a lot of things. I can imagine a world in which we have subsidies to raise wages, and then we have something like Medicare for all, and then we provide, tax benefits for childcare, or we have some kind of free pre-K, nursery school to pre-K that also helps it, so that the wage that one earns doesn't have to be stretched as widely, I think is probably the closest we will get to some of the goals of, a fight for 15 or these different efforts to raise the minimum wage.
Thank you, Marcia. I want to ask a question now that picks up on something you said earlier about your resistance to reducing all human relations to market relations or commercial relations, and wanting to understand community independent of that. And I'm just wondering how you respond to this. I'm putting on, once again, my capitalist devil's advocate hat and posing a question that might be put here. Understanding the market as a training ground for civility. Certainly capitalism exploits. But some, like the economic theorist Deirdre McCloskey, have argued that the market can also be a training ground for civility and moral community. In this view, success in the market requires the development of what might be called civility attributes. Free market exchange, the buying and selling process, depends on persuasion rather than overt coercion or violence. Best business practices require building relationships of trust. Honesty is the best policy over the long haul. Politeness generally makes for good business practice. Transparency and mutual understanding are important. Employer-employee relations involve mutual responsibilities. So honesty, trust, politeness, transparency, mutual understanding, mutual responsibility, and all such things are good attributes that all citizens in a healthy society have an interest in cultivating. If business, capitalism, does cultivate such virtues, then participation in business by anyone ought to be encouraged. That it serves as the basis for a certain kind of moral community, and therefore there is something right about capitalism as a cultural reality and a cultural practice. I mean, how would you respond to that?
I mean, the premise is compelling in the sense that she's created a vision of the marketplace that is lovely. I just don't see it. I think the idea that there is no violence that's attached to the markets is to suggest that the production that is done either, in parts of the world that are governed with no labor practices, or here in the United States, in which we see the destabilization of organized labor, in which there is no exploitation or harassment of workers, if there's no desperation among people who are working to accept these terms. I think that all of these things are possible in a context in which each and every person has the same number of choices in the market. But we know that's not true, that people with more wealth have more choices, and therefore they're able to distance themselves from some of the kind of rudeness or the messiness or the murkiness of markets. But the poor do not have those options. And so I think those values of honesty and good customer service, yes, absolutely. And at the same time, we know that those are things that are often withheld to people who are vulnerable and desperate. And whether it's in the context of the marketplace of businesses, or we can see these same things in social services organizations that serve the poor, but serve the poor with derision and degradation, then I just don't see it. I mean, I think the reality, it's like some of these debates about American history. The reality is that there's violence that is surrounding most commercial interactions if you dig deep enough. And the question is, how do we repent? How do we reconcile for either the past harms or the current harms in ways that are ethical and clear. And so I understand the desire of that argument to imagine the markets as a place that encourages the kind of positive behaviors that we want to see in civil society. I just have yet to see it. Maybe there's an industry that I'm not familiar with, but under our current conditions, I can't think of how that coheres consistently enough for us to invest in the idea further and not take the position that perhaps we need to dismantle.
Thank you. This is a question from Marcian Romanician, class of 2023, St. Olaf College. You mentioned that the polarization of our current political climate can motivate individuals and corporations alike to express their perspectives publicly, whether on social media or through corporate marketing campaigns. McDonald's, Nike, the NBA, and the NFL were given as examples. Would you consider such perspective sharing stemming out of polarization as an impetus for broader democratic involvement in the inclusion of minority voices in cultural dialogue? Or alternatively, do you see polarization as fueling only hypocrisy, empty words, and demonstrative activism, as was suggested is the case with the NFL's response to George Floyd's death? If the latter, does demonstrative activism serve as a bridge between old and reformed standards of social acceptability? There's a lot going on
I
here.
have to say, St. Olaf, best questions I've gotten in a long time. I mean, what beautifully written and thoughtful questions. I'm so grateful for them because they really are stretching me intellectually to think about, do I even have a position? How much in that gray area do I sit? So I think demonstrative activism, as you framed it in the question, is important. Taking a stand, holding a position. I think that what happens is that when there's these gut reactions, or even when these reactions are a little bit more calculated, there isn't enough either political savvy, enough education, or enough political will to take these moments of declaration from declaration to action. And so I think what we see is a lot of thoughts and prayers, a lot of, I stand with Black lives, but not understanding that these declarations can actually be opportunities for reconciliation, reflection, discernment, and really powerful action. And I think that this is why sometimes when we hear these statements, we are skeptical and we don't have enough conversion narratives on the part of leaders of institutions to say, I came into consciousness, I expressed a set of ideas, and I've radically changed the way I've done things. Because I think that what we find ourselves in is a moment of so much chaos, of so much confusion, so much exhaustion, but we are trying to make a difference kind of alone, and we can only really make a difference in community. And so I think what's lacking sometimes is not just the moral courage to act on these kind of new ideas, but the understanding that this requires a complete and total shift, a complete and total upending of business as usual. And corporations are really in the kind of in the path to do that. And so as a result, these expressions or these ideas will always fall short because they don't harness the entire capacity and ability of the organization. What it usually means is the organization will graft on a few ideas, they'll try a few things, and if it works, if it doesn't work, there's no kind of sense that this is for the long haul. And this is why, in many ways, the ideas that are coming from corporate America, the ideas that are coming from higher education about diversity and inclusion and opening up the tent, these are ideas that were, the trial balloon was in 1968, and the political will for them kind of shifted into the 1980s. And then there was another kind of moment in maybe the 1990s, and then there was another moment. And so we're locked in a cycle of history around the response to racism where people don't understand that anti-racism is actually about dismantling and building back up. I think people want to either siphon off some of the work or kind of make these precise cuts in order to maintain the status quo. And that's why we have these kind of negative feelings in these moments, because we are rarely privy to real narratives of transformation.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. This is from Emily from Norfolk, Virginia. Can you comment on the relationship between environmental justice and the massive industrial consumption of beef that McDonald's has helped foster? There are normative viewpoints out there that would claim that vegetarianism, a practice which would be opposed to McDonald's product, would be better for the planet. Thanks.
You know, I am not an environmental scientist, but I think we do know about the incredible environmental impact of the supply chain, not just of McDonald's beef, but a number of products. I recently had the pleasure of working with the podcast Proof from America's Test Kitchen to do 2 episodes about the fast food industry. And the first episode, I interviewed a writer named Alex Park, who writes about kind of the global history of fried chicken. And it was bananas, the kind of supply chain that's necessary for Kentucky Fried Chicken right now. Because there are fewer religious prohibitions against the consumption of chicken, fried chicken is found all over the world. And he was explaining to me like what it took to bring KFC to Nigeria, and decades-long agreements with suppliers, changes in chicken farming, all of these different needs in order to make sure there's a supply of KFC. And so I think that we are contending with, kind of the convergence of a series of crises. And I think it's been happening for a long time with the kind of need to supply the food chain. And I just want to be really, really clear. It's not just McDonald's. It's the variety of foods available in the American supermarket. I often use this example when I talk to my students, but when I was a kid, you couldn't get a pineapple all the time. It was like very rare to see in a supermarket. And now we have mechanisms for pineapples to be shipped all year round. Rotisserie chickens weren't invented until I was not invented, but were available in the commercial market at the volumes that they are available now until I was in high school. And so people just didn't consume so much poultry. I didn't consume so much poultry. You didn't constantly have it available. And so I think that the American diet and the American expectation that all foods are available all the time is also a culprit in this. But, part of it is the result of certain subsidies on certain types of food products, the expansion of food companies, and again, the expectation that whenever you have a hankering for something, you should have it available to you regardless of where you live. And so if I went to the supermarket down the street from my house, there'll probably be a pineapple. There should be a pineapple so far away from places that produce pineapples. And so I think that increasingly as people are critiquing fast food, from a labor perspective and an environmental perspective, at the intersection are farm workers who are supplying this incredible demand and are in some cases even more imperiled than people who are working in the fast food restaurants.
Thank you so much, Marcia. We have come to the end of our time. Thanks to the audience for joining us tonight for this stimulating exchange with Marcia Chatelain, Georgetown University professor, extraordinarily accomplished American social historian and author of the recently published franchise, The Golden Arches in Blank America. Thanks to all who provided questions for our discussion tonight. And thanks so much to you, Marcia, for being with us and sharing with us your keen insights and wisdom on matters of race in America.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you, St. Olaf community. Hopefully next time we'll be together in person and I get to visit one of my favorite states, Minnesota.
We look forward to that. The St. Olaf Institute for Freedom and Community has several other virtual events scheduled this fall focused on our national crises considered and debated during this momentous presidential election season, the crises of polarization, pandemic, and prejudice. Learn more about these events at institute.stolaf.edu, that is to say institute.stolaf.edu. We hope you can join us. For now, good night, be safe, and be well.